Good morning, everybody, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to everybody. So today, what I'm going to be talking to you about is how the industry has changed. So when we talk about the industry, the construction industry, but I'm also going to put quite a focus on the building control side of things. So my name is Zoe Cox, and I am a building inspector previously. So I started off my career as a local authority building inspector. I then went into academia and was teaching building control and construction. And now I've moved to Quadrant, the soccer tech company, as their head of training. So my role is very much around the building control industry and the construction industry as a whole. Just to add a little bit more depth to where my experience and background has come from, I've also heavily been involved with the Chartered Association of Building Engineers. I'm currently their vice president at the moment, but with my presidential year next year. So I've been really fortunate to see the industry from all these different perspectives. So from local authority perspective, now to what was previously an approved inspector, now an RBCA, so we're now registered building control approvers perspective. So I've had a really good opportunity to see how the industry has evolved over the years. However, we now know that recently there's been some really quite big and significant changes. So unfortunately, very sadly, Grenfell was one of the occasions and one of the incidents, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, which has really made us reflect and look at our industry. How do we make buildings safer? Tragically, so many people, 72 residents lost their lives at Grenfell. The inquiry has now been released. So we are now obviously starting to look at what happened, what went wrong, what have we learned from this? How can we make buildings safer? How can we actually improve where we live, what we do, and our industry? So on the back of this was the Hackett report, which was released by Dame Julie Hackett. And based on this, there was quite a few things that were identified, and on the back of it also quite a few recommendations that were made. So what we need to consider here is, how are we going to actually improve building safety? How can we prevent something similar to Grenfell happening again in the future? So what the recommendations identified was, first of all, that safety work wasn't being carried out or documented correctly. This is crucial. I also have a health and safety background, so I understand the paramount importance of health and safety. How do we keep people safe in and around buildings? What can we do to actually enhance this? Materials were not performing to the standards they had supposedly been testing for. We must make sure that the materials are being used correctly, in the right environment, in the right situation. We've also had things like wooden balconies, which caused the fire to spread. The report recommendations have said, obviously, now we have got to have clear models of risk ownership. So basically what this is saying is that now anybody involved in a process, which we'll talk about more in a minute, has to actually take responsibility for their part in that process. There's accountability now. Previous to this, building control has been a relatively sort of unregulated profession. And obviously this is now something that's changed. So we've now got responsibilities for the client, for the designer, principal designer, the contractor. So basically what is happening now is we now have duty holders. And the purpose of these duty holders is to ensure that somebody is held accountable for their part in that process. Okay, so we will talk a little bit more about the actual duty holders specifically in a few minutes. Things such as the transparency of information and clear audit trails. Previously, a building could just be put together, everybody had a bit of an input into it. Nobody really knows who was responsible for what area of that. That's all changed. We now have what's called the golden thread of information. And this is basically information that is contained about the building throughout, literally from the minute it's obviously at the design stage, right the way through its building, through the construction of it, and into obviously the afterwards effects of that. So we now have a full trail of who has been involved in what areas. So we now have the area of accountability. We also have consideration for safety during the building lifestyle, not just the construction phase. So what we now have is a lot more emphasis on the building management. We have responsible persons who not are involved in the construction process, but they are actually involved in making sure that that building is maintained going forward. So for example, fire doors in a high-rise building are maintained. Wet and dry risers have been maintained regularly. So when you need to use them, they are there, they work, they function. There is now the responsibility of somebody to do that. We did have the regulatory reform fire safety order, which did actually cover building management. However, This has now put a lot more emphasis on, and this was actually amended during the release of the new Building Safety Act, which is where all this has come from. So going forward, there is so much more responsibility on the actual maintenance of that building and ensuring that that building is safe for its occupants, which is a really, really important part of this. We now have the introduction of a regulator, the Building Safety Regulator, BSR, as commonly known. They are now regulating the profession. They are regulating buildings, particularly obviously the higher risk buildings. So we now are in a situation where we have got a regulator. We now have everybody who is accountable for the different areas in the construction process. So this is a really positive move sort of going forward. In addition to this, we also have the building control profession, which is now regulated. Okay, we'll talk a bit more about this in a minute. So in terms of the response, obviously, from the Hackett report, obviously we've got introduction to the Building Safety Regulator. This was fundamentally really important. Enhancing the safety of buildings applies to new and existing buildings over 18 metres, okay, or if they've got more than 7 stories, and they must contain 2 residential units as well. So they are the buildings that are generally categorised under here. Every approved inspector is now a registered building control approver. So approved inspector has gone. And we have a code of conduct, we have our own responsibilities to ensure that the profession is regulated, not just from a building inspector perspective, but also from the actual company and the organisation who is carrying out that work. So basically, the building control industry has gone through a really big change. Anyone that is carrying out building control work in the UK has to now be registered, okay? So they have to have undergone a competency assessment, and there are 3 different routes in which you can do this. So CAVE had a route, the Chartered Association of Building Engineers. So what that route involved was a technical report between sort of 3,000 and 6,000 words, competency statements highlighting your competency in relation to certain project types, and then you had an interview, which mine lasted about an hour and 10 and properly grilled me. But on the back of that, what this is producing is demonstrating that those working within our industry are competent. There's different classes of registration. So you can either be class 1, which is trainee grade. You've got class 2, which can cover a variety of buildings, up to sort of 11.5. And then you've got above that, you've then got obviously your class 3, which is your highest category, which looks at non-standard buildings. And it also looks at your HRB, so your high risk buildings. So you've got different classes of registration. So depending upon obviously what you demonstrated and the evidence you were able to provide, the work you carry out, you are allocated a particular grade and category of what you are registered at. So this basically says that people can undertake works that are contained within their category of registration. We then also got the total training route, which was very, very similar, which again involved assessments on the back of that. And then we also had the BSCF, which is the Building Safety Competence Framework, and that was an examination. So depending upon which route you chose to go down, that is how you got your registration. So anyone working in building control will have gone through this if they're working and do site work. And basically going forward, this is something that's going to have to be maintained, so we know that people are competent. So some examples of the changes that occurred in relation to obviously the Building Safety Act. So we've got things such as obviously compartmentation within high-rise buildings. So non-combustible materials on buildings above 18 metres and specific guidance. For anybody who doesn't understand the principles of compartmentation, so let's take a high-risk building or high-rise building, for example. Each flat should be its own fire-resistant compartment. So there should be 60 minutes fire-resistant enclosure around that particular flat. In theory, if the event of a fire in that building, the fire should remain within that compartment for 60 minutes. In theory, allowing the building owners to use what's called the stay put policy. So everybody else in that building can stay in their flats, the understanding that the fire will be put out and their flat should not be compromised. Okay, so what they've now done is brought in a new system. The problem we had with compartmentation was if the fire escapes the compartment, which it did during Grenfell, how do we notify the rest of the building that they need to get out? So we now have got emergency evacuation systems built into all HRBs. So that enables the fire service to come in and they can actually activate this system, and it will basically allow a mass evacuation of that building. So that is something that has come in to sort of obviously try and help counteract that. Fire suppression, so sprinklers in all residential buildings above 11 metres. Suppression systems are fantastic. They don't necessarily put the fire out, but they give you a lot more time to actually be able to deal with the fire, allow the fire service to arrive and manage the situation. So really critical. There's also information now for emergency services, so secure information boxes. So what this provides is information. So when the fire service turn up, they've got floor plans, they've got elevations, they've got the building management strategy, they've got the responsible person's contact details. So when they turn up on a project or on a job, where there's a fire, they've got all the information they need to be able to make a proper assessment of that building and to tackle the fire accordingly in the best way. So I mentioned earlier on about duty holders. So basically, the client, designers, contractors, principal designers, principal contractors. Anybody that knows CDM may notice that this is sort of mimicking the roles of the construction design management regulations, which it does. But basically, this now means that everybody has their own responsibilities and their own duties towards their part in the construction phase or the design phase of the project. So to go through them all, obviously you can read that for yourselves, but it just gives you a really good idea of what we are expecting from different people. So the client obviously has a responsibility to make suitable arrangements to plan, monitor, and manage a project. They have to appoint a principal designer and a principal contractor. And basically, as you go through the project, each of those people then are accountable for their particular input in that project, which is really, really important. So basically, when we think about what lessons we've learned, so we've now got the legislation that's been introduced. We've now got the Building Safety Act, which is coming. This has made quite a few significant changes to the way we are within the industry. We now have accountable people who we can actually hold responsible if they do something that they shouldn't do. We now have an audit trail, the golden thread of information, which we can actually follow all the way through the lifestyle or the lifespan of that building. We now also have responsibilities of anybody that's managing a building to now take more care. They are responsible persons, so they need to make sure that that building is safe. There's so many buildings out there in the world at the moment that are not actually safe, they're not fit for purpose. And sadly, there seems to be sort of a bit of neglect in terms of the maintenance of these buildings. But actually, if you've got a fire door missing, or if you've got a dry riser that's not working, how do you deal with this? It's going to cause a problem long term. So now we have got obviously the power and the control to actually make sure that problem's alleviated. We've now got competency, accountability, responsibility. Again, really, really sort of important areas to consider. We now have clearly defined roles, and in order to support this, they must now submit statements as well at the end of the project to say that their part of the project complies with building regulations. So again, really important, the paper trail continues. We have evidence of everything that's there. So all building control professionals have been assessed and subsequently registered to enable them to carry out the work. There is a register. So if you're ever involved in projects and you want to know whether who you are employing is actually a registered building inspector, go onto the BSR website. The information is all there. It tells you who they are, who they work for, what class of registration they've got, what buildings they're able to inspect and look at. So everything is now there. It has all come on very quickly, and I must admit the last sort of 9 months to the last year has been pretty quick for the construction industry, particularly the building control teams. But at the end of the day, I think it is a positive move that has now sort of happened. So I'm now going to hand over to Andy Travers, and he's going to talk about the New World Order and the change of mindset. Thank you.